My name is Brendan Kelly. I'm an acupuncturist and an herbalist in northern Vermont. My friend Bonnie and I, who's kind enough to film this today, came down from Burlington. And I practice at the clinic that my wife and I founded in Burlington in northwestern Vermont. And what I want to talk about today is my understanding of a Chinese medicine perspective of climate change. And I think that's relevant because before I got into practicing Chinese medicine, I've been practicing for 11 years now, full-time. I was involved in environmental issues, and I was actually a full-time environmental activist and organizer. And what has happened, as is always usually the case, at least from the view of Chinese medicine, is things have kind of come around again. And Chinese medicine, we'll talk about this wonderful symbol here, thinks in terms of symbols. And a lot of the other people who came before me this morning were thinking about that as well. So Chinese, my context is maybe a little bit different than some of the other contexts that people have been talking about. It was really extraordinary for me to see James Gates walk onto the stage this morning. I thought that he was going to be beamed in, the pioneer beamed in, and then I assumed that because he's such an amazing guy and a very well-known guy. And they said, "Here's James Hansen," and I was sitting next to Bonnie. I'm like, I am citing this guy's work in the work that I'm writing. And there he is. So my perspective is a little bit different. And what I'd like to talk about today is some of the work and the research I've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years or so on blending Chinese medicine and climate change, especially climate change science. And I'm in the process of publishing a book, submitting a book for publication this year, The Yin and Yang of Climate Change. So what I'd like to talk about is kind of the first few chapters of that book. And again, my context that I want to talk about this today from is a Chinese medicine view. So if this sounds a little bit different, or even if it sounds a lot different, it's because those are the glasses that I have on to see the world. And I think that those glasses are accessible. I don't think you have to be a Chinese herbalist or an acupuncturist or anything like that to understand it, because Chinese medicine's reference point is nature. And so if we have a relationship to nature, if we observe nature, if we're gardeners or farmers or herbalists, that we just like to be outside, then I think Chinese medicine is literally speaking our language. It's a particular cultural view. It's a particular medical view, but its basis is in nature. And I think that that's very important because those traditions, those perspectives are very grounded. They're very rooted in a natural world. A little bit about the context, historical context of Chinese medicine. As I understand it, Chinese medicine has been written about and practiced for over 5,000 years. So just that lineage, that length of time, I think is very important in our postmodern or post-postmodern culture, whatever we want to call it at this point. Because part of what we lack in our culture, in my opinion, is that lineage, is a long-term generational understanding of what works. Not only within us individually in terms of our health, but in terms of what works environmentally and what works socially. So Chinese medicine is essentially the traditional or the indigenous perspectives of China and of Asia that have been applied to medicine. And what I want to talk about today is the idea of taking those ideas, those principles out of the treatment room and into the world. And I think, in my opinion again, they really work outside of the treatment room. They work very, very well outside of the treatment room because Chinese medicine has a holographic understanding of the world. So what I mean by that is, if this is a hologram, you can break off one little corner of the picture, and that contains the whole picture. Right? That's a holographic understanding, and that's a very modern concept in many ways. But in terms of Chinese medicine, that's not modern at all. That's the basis of the medicine for 5,000 years. The understanding that the small picture, this little corner of the hologram, includes the whole hologram, and vice versa. The whole picture is the little picture. Another way of articulating that is that the microcosm is the macrocosm, and the macrocosm is the microcosm. In some ways, not very complicated. You can even say it's self-evident, right? It makes sense. But that understanding, the big picture and the little picture are related, is very important because what I want to talk about is the idea of climate change as a sickness. Not only a sickness in the climate, but a sickness within us, and us individually and us collectively. Because as we all know, I'm sure climate change just didn't come out of any, just didn't show up. It just didn't appear. Like everything's going along and everything's great, and oh my gosh, the climate is a wreck. No. What is happening in the climate is a direct reflection of what is happening within us, individually and collectively. So that's my basis, that's my perspective, that's my bias that I want to share today. In looking at the climate science, which I've been doing for a while, including citing James Hansen, so that was very interesting to see him on the stage today. Chinese medicine can make sense, again, in my opinion, of a lot of different data, a lot of different information within one common understanding of what's going on. Chinese medicine can provide a diagnosis of what's happening in the climate. And that's important because what's happening in the climate is a reflection of what's happening within us. And if we have a clear diagnosis in Chinese medicine, we can treat it. We can treat it. Chinese medicine, in my clinical practice with my wife, we treat a lot of different conditions. Physical, mental, emotional, even spiritual conditions, often at the same time. So things that can seem very difficult to treat, just taking a theoretical case study. Someone comes in with back pain, and they come in with a headache. Same person comes in with a headache, and they're tired, and they're depressed, and they hate their spouse, and they hate their job. From one view, one cultural view, one medical view, that person might need to see 3 or 4 or 5 different specialists. Right? But that only happens from a cultural view that assumes that things are separate. Right? That is not the view of Chinese medicine. The assumption in Chinese medicine is everything is interconnected. And what is everything? Everything is everything. Like it's really everything. It's not just the this part of everything. It's the everything of everything. Physically, mentally, emotionally, things are interconnected. We are interconnected to each other. We as humans are interconnected to the planet. The planet is interconnected to the universe. It's everything. Which is why it's so fun to talk at this conference, because this is what this conference is about. So I want to add my little Chinese medicine 2 cents to the discussion. So someone comes in with a long list of symptoms, and sometimes they come in and they're very discouraged. They have seen multiple specialists perhaps, they're on Western medications perhaps, sometimes it's working, sometimes it's not. And they're kind of, they don't know what to do. But from a Chinese medical view, what we're trying to understand is where the symptoms are coming from. Right? It's not enough to understand the symptoms, and it's not even enough to understand the diagnosis, whether it's a Western diagnosis or a Chinese diagnosis, because the symptoms are what Chinese medicine calls the branches. The symptoms are up here, and it's good to know the condition of the branches, right? If you've got an apple orchard, it's good to know what's going on in the branches in the apple orchard. It's not that the branches are not important, it's not that the symptoms are not important, it's that, but those symptoms are being fed by the root. Whether it's a personal issue, an issue in an orchard, or an issue in an environment. The branches are coming, the condition of the branches are coming from the condition of the root. So for us in the treatment room, if we can understand where these branches are coming from, what Chinese medicine calls the root cause, or the root causes, plural, we can treat it. And the truth is, for the last 11 years, I see this happen every day. I see how headaches and back pain and depression and anxiety and existential crises can all be treated potentially at the same time if you understand where it's coming from. And in my opinion, having that holistic perspective is much harder if you have a medical view or a societal view that assumes disconnection. Because the truth is, that's what we have. For the most part, there are exceptions. I'm sure many of us in this room are an exception. But in general, our assumption is that things are separate. Our assumption is that all of our organs are separate. Our assumption is that our physical body is disconnected from our mental understanding of the world. Now, Western medicine is starting to make that connection, and that is sometimes literally presented as this cutting-edge revolutionary idea that the body is connected to the mind. That's not revolutionary so much in Chinese medicine. In fact, that has been the basis of the medicine, without exaggeration, for 5,000 years. Okay? So we can take those holistic understandings and apply it on an individual level to individual health, to a cultural level, and to an environmental level. So the importance of that is that when you have severe symptoms, and this is based on my training and my clinical experience, if you have severe symptoms, it's essential to treat where they're coming from. If your apple orchard is dying because the trees are not getting enough nutrients, it's essential to feed the root. If your big swath of tomato plants is dying because the roots are not being watered, you have to water the roots. You have to get to the root cause of it. And we treat a number of people in many different conditions. We're treating more advanced conditions now, Lyme disease and cancer, etc. And my clinical experience demonstrates that with the severity of the symptoms, it becomes even more urgent to treat where they're coming from. We need to understand what climate change is about. And I'm going to give you my 2 cents about it. There will be other opinions, other traditional perspectives, other indigenous perspectives about it. What I want to talk about is my understanding of Chinese medicine and how it speaks to that. So one of the oldest medical traditions of any kind that's still in existence is yin and yang. So we all know this symbol, right? And it's not just for tattoos. It actually predates tattoos. Though I think it can look like a fine tattoo as well. So just again to kind of explain some of the thinking of yin and yang, it's not a coincidence that it's a circle. Chinese medicine understands things cyclically in terms of circles. It's also not a coincidence how the picture is conceived. The white is the yang. So yang is white. Sorry, can you see this in the back?
Yes.
Okay. And in balance to the white is the black. So as the white reaches its peak, as there is a full expression of the yang, the yin begins to appear. As the yang reaches the yin reaches its full expression, the yang begins to appear. So another way of talking about that is when you take something as far as it can go, it transforms. So very important idea, because if we conceptualize the world as being linear, if we have what we could call a Newtonian perspective of the world, dating back to Sir Isaac Newton from the Enlightenment, who as a Western philosopher literally and metaphorically described the universe as a machine, then we can understand the world as being flat. Essentially, time is flat. This is the past, the present, and the future. But Chinese medicine conceptualizes things much more circularly. So if you take something as far as it can go, if you take the yang as far as it can go, it becomes something else. If you take the yin as far as it can go, it becomes something else. Very important idea. And we'll talk about where I think we are culturally in terms of this little diagram. So yang is white. Yang is also warmth. Yin is coolant. Yang is growth. Yin is contraction. Yang is big. Yin is small. Yang is the new. Yin is the old. Yang, and this next part is not gender specific, but I do want to put it down here. The yang is more male, non-gender specific understanding of male, and the yin is more female, again, not gender specific. Chinese medicine is really fond of association. So rather than understanding yin and yang in isolation, we understand yin and yang in relationship to each other. So something reaches a peak and it transforms. Also within, another central idea, within the yang there is a dot of the yin. Within the yin there is a dot of the yang. Again, very, very important, I think, in terms of personal health, but also in terms of climate sustainability. in Chinese medicine, as I was talking about before, the clarity of the diagnosis allows us to treat the condition effectively. What I want to talk about today is what I think is a very clear diagnosis in terms of what's happening with the climate, and that clarity of the diagnosis allows us the potential, the opportunity to self-administer the medicine that we need. So in Chinese medicine, for example, in our clinic, we don't just treat general. We don't treat depression in general. We try to understand where those diagnoses are coming from. So to understand what is happening in the climate, I want to go through a little bit of the science. And clearly I am not Dr. Hansen, so this is not my primary form of understanding, but I think I have a good enough understanding to lay it out. And the reason I want to lay it out is because we can understand the Western climate science potentially very, very clearly in terms of Chinese medicine. It makes sense. So I want to lay it out here because I think I can then talk about what I think those things mean, and then translate that into climate diagnosis, and then talk about how the climate is connected to us. So what has been happening over the last several generations includes ocean acidification. And I actually learned about this from Dr. Hansen in his great book, Storms of My Grandchildren. So ocean acidification involves the ability of the oceans to hold greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases are by their carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, for example, are all acidic in nature. So what the oceans have been doing is holding those greenhouse gases. Well, what appears to have happened, according to Dr. Hansen and other people, is that the oceans literally may have reached their saturation point, right? This is very, very significant because the oceans are, water is yin, and fire is yang. So oceans are an example of the planet's yin, of the planet's ability to cool itself down. So the fact that it has reached saturation point, to translate that into Chinese medicine, we can say the yin has reached its capacity. The yin of the oceans may no longer be able to buffer the effects of the warmth. And we can understand warmth in terms of yang. So what has happened is the yin has gone down. And as a result of the cooling nature of the oceans going down, it is having a warming effect. Warmth is yang. So coolant has gone down, and as a result of that, the warmth has gone up. That's one factor. Another factor is deforestation. Deforestation happens when we in the United States and other people around the world cut down the forests, but also forests are dying based on the effects of global warming. I lived in, had a clinic out in Montana for 6 years with my wife, and we lived in the Gallatin Valley in the town of Bozeman, beautiful place, and you could see deforestation happening there. The pine beetles were no longer being killed off in the winter, and whole stretches of landscape, which in the big sky country of Montana could literally be dozens of miles, were turning brown. And you go back to that same place a couple months later, a couple years later, and it would be more brown. So deforestation is the loss of trees, obviously the loss of forests. Well, what do forests do from the view of Western science? They hold greenhouse gases. They hold carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. So forests, by their nature, from the Chinese view, are yin. They are cooling. Also, because yin and yang, we can understand it in different ways, trees just stand there, right? Standing there is yin. So we can understand both from climate science as well as just looking at trees that they have a yin nature. So deforestation cuts down the trees, so the trees die off. It's a loss of the ability of those trees to sequester carbon. That is a loss of a cooling effect. That means the yin is going down. So when the coolant goes down, what happens? That has a warming effect globally. The yang goes up. Right? Next factor. There's 4 main factors. Next factor is thawing. And we'll say thawing, actually. Yeah, we'll just say, we'll start with melting. And things that are melting include glaciers, ice sheets. And an ice sheet is the same essentially as a glacier, except part of its structure is on land. Bogs. So water is yin. So water by its nature, from the Chinese view, separate from Western science now, but water by its nature is cooling. When something is in an even more yin state, for example, water, it is even more yin. So things that are frozen, glaciers, for example, or ice sheets, are not only cooling in their nature in that they involve water, but they're a frozen form of water. So from the Chinese view, this is a movement from a more yin state to a more yang state. And from the view of Western climate science, what happens when the glaciers melt and the ice sheets melt or recede is that the soil is exposed and the water, the oceans are exposed. And what happens is that the sunlight that would otherwise be reflected into the atmosphere is absorbed. So, same idea. The receding of the glaciers, the receding of the ice sheets have a warming effect. And from the Chinese view, the warming effect is coming from a lack of yin, right? Things are transforming from a more colder state, a more frozen state, into a more liquid state, which is the transition from more yin to more yang. So what is the result of this? The cooling nature is going down, and the warming nature is going up. If it seems like there's a pattern, it's because there's a pattern. So we have one more thing I'd like to talk about. So this is melting part 1. This is melting part 2. Melting part 2 involves permafrost. Permafrost in the ocean and as up here in bogs. So permafrost just means something that was permanently frozen is now melting. So what is that? That's this. That's the transition, again, from a more yin frozen state to a more yang thawed out state. And so what we're finding is really extraordinary, almost science fiction-y Western research and Western observations that are happening now, especially in the Arctic Ocean, where large sections of the permafrost underneath the ocean, there's 2 main places the permafrost is, on land, in the bogs, and in the oceans. Until recently, permanently frozen floors of the oceans are now thawing out. Why is that happening? Because the planet is warming, and because the oceans are warming. And what's happening as the result of that is huge plumes of methane are being released from the ocean floor. And as recently as 2008, so about 5 years ago, when they saw those plumes, they were small. Right? And now, according to one of the preeminent Arctic Ocean scientists, they're up to 1 kilometer wide. So why does that matter? Because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. Depending on who you talk to, it's between 20 times to up to 100 times more of a potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Very, very significant. And the original hypothesis about this methane, because the ocean floors are kilometers deep, depending on where it is, the thought was, well, the methane will dissolve in the ocean before it reaches the top, of the ocean itself. That's no longer happening. There are literally kilometer-wide plumes of methane that are being released from the ocean floor, and there's hundreds of them, depending on the season, in the Arctic, that is now being released. The methane is being released in the atmosphere. So what is that? That is this, where methane was being held in a more yin, dormant state underneath the ocean floor, and it's now being released. So that's a loss of yin, a loss of cooling effect, and an increase of yang. The exact same dynamic is happening in the bogs. There's massive releases of methane happening in the bogs, especially in Siberia. And there's all kinds of predictions in computer modeling that if anyone needs to not sleep for a couple of nights, you could just go look at that. Right. So what is happening? The yin of the planet is going down and the yang is going up. Right? So this is, Chinese medicine can provide us a way to see the pattern. And this is very, very important because this has a term. This is a specific Chinese medical diagnosis. What this is called is yin deficient heat. This is the diagnosis of the planet. This is what climate science is telling us is happening. We overlay a view of Chinese medicine, we overlay a Chinese medical perspective onto this. This pattern clearly emerges. Yin deficient heat, it's not just that the heat is rising, it's the ability of the planet to cool itself down, the ability of the planet to keep the methane in the ground, the ability of the planet to absorb and sequester greenhouse gases in trees, for example, or to also absorb those gases in the ocean. All of that has gone down. The significance of this is once we have the diagnosis, we can understand the remedies. Because we're not trying to, again, we're not trying to treat a headache in general with a person. We're not trying to treat back pain in general. We're trying to understand what's causing it. This is a very clear diagnosis of what is happening in the planet. So, the question becomes, what do we do? What do we do with the planet that is experiencing yin deficient heat? Well, we look to the root cause. And where is this coming from? Us. We are the root cause of the yin deficient heat. So when we understand that, then part of the sickness is within us, and part of the cure is within us. Because yin deficient heat didn't just show up. It's come from our institutions, it's come from our systems, and ultimately it is coming from the way we view the world. We can talk about things like corporate greed. Important to talk about. We can talk about the monopolization of agriculture by huge companies. Very important. We can talk about the need to put solar panels on our roof. I'm very happy to say we just got ours up last week in northern Vermont. So we're totally off the grid. We drive a hybrid car, we eat local, all of that. That's all important. But that is still the branch. That is still out here. That's talking about climate change as something that is only happening outside of us. And it is happening outside of us, clearly. The planet is clearly warming. But the origin of it is within us. Our internal condition, individually and collectively, is what is creating this. And looking at it clinically again, guess what one of the most common diagnoses is in our clinic? I'll give you a guess.
Yin deficient heat.
Oh my gosh! Correct. Yin deficient heat. This is one of the most common diagnoses in our clinic. So this is responsible for night sweats. It's responsible usually for hot flashes. It's responsible for things like ADHD in kids. It's also responsible for things like not being able to slow down. It's responsible for things like not being able to take a break, not being able to unplug from our technological society, the need for constant entertainment, the need for the next new thing, whether that's the new cell phone, or it's the new album, or it's the new perspective, or the new rally, whatever that new thing is. The yin is the old, and the yang is the new. So when we have yin deficient heat, because of the holistic thinking in Chinese medicine, it shows up on all levels. It shows up in terms of our internal temperature. Many of us feel too hot. physically feel too hot. It shows up mentally. Our minds are spinning out. We can't cool things down internally. We have too much heat internally. Emotionally, it's being really freaked out by climate change. Right? We can say being freaked out with climate change is adding fuel to the fire. It's not to say that this is not real. Right? One perspective is, oh, everything's going to be fine, and the plumes are fine, and oh, great. Hey, let's buy the next big thing. Right? It's not to deny that. But the cure for climate change, part of the cure for climate change lies within us. So with a planet that is warming from a lack of yin, we need to clear out our own heat and tonify our own yin. So heat is overstimulation, physically, mentally, emotionally. The yin is the coolant. It is the peace. It is also the wisdom. So one thing that happens when we individually and collectively lack yin is we lack wisdom. And we lack wisdom. We lack a multi-generational way of understanding what is truly sustainable. Right? If you want to sum up our cultural condition, it's yin deficient. We are encouraged to want the next new thing, to want the next big idea, to buy the new thing that has been marketed to us. In fact, we have set up whole structures based on that. One of the notable ones is our economic system. Our current economic system is based on growth. Right. So you don't have to understand about Chinese medicine. You just have to look to nature. What is growing all the time?
Roots.
What's that?
Roots.
Yes, but do they ever stop growing? No. Okay. Well, my hypothesis is that they will, and eventually they'll die off and they'll stop growing. That there is a growth, there is an expansion and a contraction. And so as I see it, anything in nature will expand and contract, and even really big things eventually will die and be broken down. So using our economic system as an example, we are encouraged to believe it's not only possible, but desirable to have something grow forever. You don't need to have a PhD in Chinese medical philosophy to understand that that does not make sense. And not only does it not make sense, why would we want that to happen? Why do we think that that's a desirable state? And some people will say, well, it creates jobs, and that's just how it is. It just has to be that way. But what that demonstrates is a fundamental overemphasis on the yang. We believe that yang, in many cases, is better than yin. So another way of thinking about yang is summer, and yang is day. Yin is winter, and yin is night. So when we're saying we believe it's not only possible or desirable to have one of our institutions grow continuously, we're saying we want it to be a warm summer day all the time. That's what we're saying. That's the energetic equivalent of what we're saying. Does that make sense? I mean, I like summer. I like the day. I like warmth. But I'm not assuming that it's always going to be sunny, it's always going to be day, and it's always going to be summer. It doesn't make sense. Because what balances the growth? Contraction. What balances the warmth is the coolant. What balances the summer is the winter. What balances the day is the night. And we seem to either have forgotten this or overlooked this. And the consequences of that assumption show up everywhere in our culture, in our country, and it's manifesting as climate change. We are fundamentally out of balance. But the good part about that, the good part about, it's all messed up and the data's coming in and this is just climate change. What about the hole in the ozone layer? What about nuclear waste? What about the poisoning of the soil and the air? What about all that? Well, the good news is, if you take yang far enough, what does it become? Yin. That's where we are. We have taken the assumptions of growth and bigness and new and expansion so far. There is nowhere else to go, according to this model, but into the yin. And that's what we're seeing. The yin, What's that?
We pushed it to the limit.
Correct. And we push it to the limit. And if we see things as linear, right? If we see this is sustainable and this is unsustainable, it's like, oh man, it's going so far in this direction. You want it to go in this direction. But if it's circular, we push it to the limit and it becomes something else.
So we ought to keep buying things?
Faster.
That's one option. And I've had people ask me that. I've had people ask me that. You know? Right. So the question was, should we? Another option is, rather than, take it. In my opinion, we're somewhere in here. Right. We probably haven't taken it as far as it can go energetically or biologically, but we're close. So rather than saying, well, let's push it literally right to the line, right there, we can just move here. Rather than going here, we just go whoop, and then we're in the yin. And so what is the yin? The yin is the local. The yin is the value of quality over quantity. It is the feminine. A non-gender specific understanding of feminine. We all have yin and yang within us. It is less. It is less emissions. What's that? It is the internal rather than the external. It's all of those things on the end. So you can say the local food movement, the emphasis on internal practices like Tai Chi and Qigong and yoga and meditation, the small house movement, the reduce emissions movement, the reforestation movement, the emphasis on the local, the internal, the feminine, that's all the yin. So it's happening, right? It's happening. We are moving towards the yin. And I think what this model provides us is a way to make sense of it. It's like, how does all this data make sense? How does all of these different social movements make sense? It makes sense because we're somewhere in here, and you maybe haven't taken it as far as you could possibly go, but we're pretty close. And the transition is from the yang to the yin. And the good thing about that is that's potentially very simple. That's as simple as the transition from the day to the night. That's as simple as a transition from the summer to the winter. And when we have all of this, difficult issues, difficult science confronting us, it can seem overwhelming. But it doesn't have to be overwhelming, because this is the inertia. The inertia is not towards unsustainability and injustice, in my opinion. The inertia is, having taken all of that so far, there is nowhere else to go but into the yin. And that's not to imply that we should, just sit at home and watch HBO and eat bonbons all day, right? It's not to imply to not engage in the world. But rather than there being a movement towards, destruction or towards health, where the movement is towards the yin, which is life, literally life. The feminine is the life. So that is where we're going. So to me, people say, well, how do you ask questions like, well, how do you maintain optimism? With all of this, the data, and I see lots of people clinically who are doing well, and how do you maintain optimism? This doesn't take optimism. Do you have to be optimistic each day to think it's going to become night? Serious. Do you have to be optimistic in July to say, man, I hope it becomes February. I'm going to have faith that it will be cold again in February. Does it take that? No. It does not take that. You do not need to be optimistic to think that the yang will become the yin. This is a natural flow of energy. I will even say it is an inevitable flow of energy. So part of it for me is this is where it's going. So one way that I approach it is to ride that. Literally and metaphorically, ride that wave. Ride the wave from the yang to the yin. Ride the wave from the big to the small. Ride the wave from valuing the quantity of something rather than the quality of something. Because that's where it's going. This is the transition that we're making. So, again, it's not to imply that we don't all have a collective responsibility to be engaged in this process, but the wind is literally at our backs. It's not against us, it's with us. Yeah?
A couple things. This was very interesting and helpful. Let me just throw out two things.
Yeah.
One is tipping points.
Yeah.
And the second is the power of the fossil fuel industry over the U.S. government and much of the world's economy and government, for that matter. And just a minute on each of those.
Yeah.
It's not like the Earth, to me, I don't think we can just expect or assume or believe that the Earth is going to be capable of rebounding from what we're doing to it. Because we've gone so far, right? And particularly in terms of climate, with the potential that we are very close, we definitely are very close to tipping points.
Yeah.
We've gone so far that it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to come back from. That's number one in terms of climate. But then the other thing is the fossil fuel industry and their power. Because you could say on one level that yours is much deeper, but you could say that it's really the fossil fuel industry that is the source of the problem when it comes to climate change. You're going much deeper than that, which is good. But the fossil fuel industry's got to be prioritized, it seems to me, if we're going to get out from where we are to the renewable energy reality and the renewable energy-based economy that we need.
Yeah. Very reasonable questions. I'll give you my take on this. I'll start first with the fossil fuel industry. My question, which is real. I was a political activist. I was engaged in all kinds of stuff. I was having conversations with Bill McKibben in the late 1980s about this stuff. So I think all of those things are real. But my question, I would say that the power of the fossil fuel industry is a real reality, but again, it's a symptom. The fossil fuel industry has power because of the misguided assumptions that we have in terms of our individual understanding of things and our collective institutions. It's not that it's real. It's not that it's not real. And we treat people, for example, with cancer, stage 2, stage 3 cancer. It's not that the cancer is not real. It's that the cancer is a symptom of the deeper issues. My response to the power of the fossil fuel industry is, how did that happen? How did we create an economic system that, one, allows the fossil fuel industry to exist as it's existing now, but that is also based on the assumption of short-term economic growth? How did we get there? So it's not, I'm not trying to dodge the question or dodge your opinion. What I'm saying is that is still a symptom. We have allowed certain worldviews, certain assumptions to be predominant. And I would translate that in terms of the yin-yang understanding into yang. We value the big over the small. We value the interest of a select group of people over the collective good. So even something as severe as that symptom is still a branch issue. Where did that come from? It comes from an economic system that's based on short-term economic self-interest. It's also based on the assumption of disconnection. The assumption that we are somehow disconnected from the world around us. So a more holistic, a more inclusive understanding is yin. We are nature. It's not that we're connected to nature. We are nature. We are the water. We are the environment. We are the soil. So this is the power of the fossil fuel industry is a very dramatic and very real, symptomatic manifestation of the deeper cultural issues. So that's my answer to that. In terms of tipping point is also real. What happens, and this can happen within people individually. What happens with tipping point individually basically is that the yang gets so severe, the warmth gets so dramatic, it burns off most of the yin, and then there's a dramatic flaring of internal heat. One example of that would be metastasization, when cancer metastasizes in the body, where you have a localized issue of cancer. And it's significant. The reason I'm using the cancer analogy is because from the Chinese medical perspective, or my understanding of it, cancer is about heat. Cancer is what the term in Chinese medicine is fire toxins. The heat has gotten so severe that it's fire, and that fire is creating toxicity. And the reason that those fire toxins spread quickly with metastasizing is because there's a lack of coolant. So is there a possibility of tipping point? Yes. And within a person, that's when the heat is so severe there's not enough yin. Within the climate, things warm up so much, the ability to sequester carbon and keep things cool has gone down. So is that real? Yes. But again, that is, in my opinion, again, a symptom. That is a branch. So if we're really concerned about tipping point, which is real, in my understanding, it's of real urgency to understand where it's coming from. What are the root assumptions in our own lives, in our culture's understanding of things that is causing it? If we're really concerned about cancer metastasizing, we're really concerned about tipping point, let's treat the root. Let's treat the root of separation and isolation. The root belief that big is better than small, that new is better than old, that international is better than local, that greed is better than compassion. Those are the root causes. That's where it's coming from. So I'm not dodging it. I'm just saying, even those severe symptoms are just the branches. We need to go to the root. Yeah.
I need some tiny explanation here.
Sure.
How can, I think you said that yin is life.
Well,
Now-
yin is the source of life. Yeah. Yin is literally and metaphorically the source of life. The
Okay.
yin is the basis of life, and yang is the expression of life. Right? So our life, from the Chinese view, originates from the yin. And the expression of our life in the world is the yang.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Looking at your diagram there, you're suggesting that, and I'll use compass points, that if we head in a kind of a southeasterly direction,
Right?
that we can intercept the yin somewhere in the middle
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
But that would be a choice. Now, if we don't make that choice and we head in a northeasterly direction, we're headed for a problem.
Clearly.
Now, I can agree with you that we're going to eventually reach that yin situation,
Right.
but the question is how we're going to get there. One way of getting there, and this has to do with all living populations, is if we overpopulate to the point where, in the case of human beings, war will bring us to that point, or famine, or disease, or a combination of everything, which is not a very good perspective. Whereas if we make an intelligent choice and head southeast, that could be much more a gentle way of getting there.
Yeah.
How are we sure which way we're going to do it?
I don't know. It is a choice. The question for me, I think that's a great addition. The yang becomes the yin. To me, that is inevitable. The question is how gracefully and intelligently we're going to make the transition. Is it from total catastrophe? Is that a possibility? Yes. Is it possible that people lose their own internal yin and the cancer metastasizes? It absolutely is a possibility. But it's also a possibility to make the graceful, intelligent transition rather than from the extreme here. Rather than going directly east,
So my question
we head
is, how
southeast.
do we make sure that the total human population makes that graceful choice?
We treat the root. We treat,
What's the
we treat
treatment?
the root.
What's
What's
the
that?
treatment? What's the treatment?
To self-administer and understand. So in the book I'm writing, I talk about yin and yang, but I also talk about other Chinese medical perspectives in this. But we can talk about it in more detail if we include the 5 phases or the 5-element understanding of it. But in terms of yin and yang, we treat the root causes. If we have yang excess and a lack of yin, we need to cultivate yin in our own lives, personally. The remedy for climate change is within. We need to cultivate it in our families, in our communities, and eventually in the culture, in the country. It might not seem realistic, but you could say it's not realistic either to treat stage 3 breast cancer with herbs and acupuncture. It's not realistic to treat back pain and headaches and depression and insomnia and an existential crisis all at the same time. That doesn't sound realistic either. From one view, you'd have to go see 4 or 5 specialists. From another view, you can't. The only way you can treat stage 3 breast cancer is with chemo and radiation and mastectomy. That's one view. Another view is all of that is totally possible. I believe it's possible. If we understand where it's coming from and we treat that, things can change. For example, all your tomato plants are dying. They're all wilting, the fruit looks like crap, they're turning brown. What am I going to do? What if you got a 5-gallon pail of water and you just watered it? And you came back a day later and they all looked different. That is possible. That is the yin. Simply because this is one possibility, that doesn't mean it's the only possibility. If you treat the root of the condition, everything can change. Is it a guarantee? No. Is it a possibility? Yes, I think it is, yeah.
What about the idea that if some people are already living in the yin category, they're already in the black,
Right,
and they're pulling the others along?
sure, absolutely.
Why not?
Why
It
not?
doesn't have to be sudden, it could be.
And the yin, again, is local agriculture, it is community, it is the small, it is this.
Meditation,
It is
right.
this, right? So it's not as if it's some clear dichotomy. It's already here. And the inertia is already going there. So the question is, are we gonna go this way, or are we gonna head south by southeast? That's it. Yeah,
We are already, we're living in that balance on the one hand. 90% of all the resources consumed on the planet are consumed by the wealthy 10% of the people.
yes,
But
Right.
that 90% of the poor people
yeah,
are struggling every minute
right.
to try to get to be part of that 10%.
Well,
Or
or livable life.
12%.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Well, I think part of what it takes is, in terms of this understanding, a revaluing of yin and yang. And revaluing is more better than less, is new better than old, is doing better than not doing. It is only in a perspective that overvalues the yang that we assume, by definition, we want more and bigger and better. It's not now, to say that, I'm not now saying the yang is bad. I'm not saying there's no place for technology, there's no place for newness, there's no place for expansion. There clearly is, but we need to be discerning. Do we need new technology? Yes. We need technology that eliminates emissions, that can create sustainable, cost-effective power, maybe some breeding of plants, not GMO breeding, but breeding of plants to extend growing seasons. It's not that the yang is bad, we just need to be discerning. And in my opinion, a main thing that the United States has exported is our overemphasis on yang. That's really what we've exported, right? So we call that progress. We call that development. What it is vacuuming the yang over the yin. I think if we just step back and we kind of deal with our own things for a while, and we genuinely help other people, I also think that this is possible to balance. I don't think there's an inevitability that everyone in the world wants to be a suburban American. And having grown up in suburban America, I can say that that's not necessarily such a great thing anyway, in many ways. So I think if we understand what the cause of the condition is, and we don't try to export our beliefs, which is, again, in my opinion, from the view of Chinese medicine, a valuing of the yang over the yin, there's more chance of it being balanced. And one way that we reduce our own consumption, so maybe there is more things to go around in our country and in the world. Yeah.
You know, when you were asked about the treatment, you didn't include political action and organizing.
Yeah.
You know, building organizations like 350.org,
Yeah.
take a very concrete example.
Yeah.
That are on the one hand, they're building community
Yeah.
and they're giving people hope,
Yeah.
right? And giving people who are part of that movement some sense of connections to other people. They're doing a lot of things that we need in terms of personal, right? Because of the way that they're doing the organizing,
Right.
right? But, so, you know, I think that's part of the treatment too, very much so. Because if we're not doing that, if we're not doing those things, if we're only doing the individual things,
I agree.
or just the local things, and we stop at that,
I agree.
and are not seeing the need for these interconnections, you know, statewide, nationally, internationally, you know, dealing with the powers that are very much responsible for a lot of what's going on to us and to all the species that we are, you know, trying to preserve.
Yeah.
It's not enough.
I would agree with that, and I would say, being in Vermont, and there's a lot of 350 organizing going on there, and I know the main organizers, a lot of main organizers in Vermont, I would say that their approach to organizing is more yin. It's not top-down. It's much more going out this way other than this way. So I would say that I think that is very important. But my addition to that is, how is our own balance of yin and yang? Are we too hot? Are we too overstimulated? Are we overly engaged in the world and not contemplative? And the reason I think that that's important is because how are we going to balance the yin and yang in a dysfunctional world if we don't experience it internally? I don't think that that's a tangential thing. I think if we want to see a balance of yin and yang in the world, we have to embody it. Or to paraphrase Mahatma Gandhi, we have to become the changes we wish to see in the world. But that's not just external. That's not just out there. From a Chinese medical understanding, it's internal. How is our ability to rest? How is our ability to slow down and unplug? It's not to deny what 350 is doing. And again, I've worked with them, I've gone on walks, I've gone to demonstrations. It's not that that's not important, but that's a condition. How do we hope to balance the yin and yang in the country if we're not balancing yin and yang internally? My view is I don't think it's going to happen. Yeah?
Sorry, go ahead.
You used the word possibility a little while ago, and one of my continuing problems over 30 years has been with the emphasis in the climate debate on fact or on certainty or on the need for certainty, which I think is spurious because every day we make decisions based on probability. We carry an umbrella because we think it might rain, not because we know it is going to.
Right.
In Chinese medicine, how does that question of possibility, of not knowing, enter into the creation of a therapeutic regime?
It's a great question because it really speaks to some of the differences between Western medicine and Chinese medicine. Western medicine, which in my view is a reflection of Western culture, is looking for certainty. And that's based on a philosophical orientation. Chinese medicine is more oriented on looking at patterns and probability. So looking at cancer, for example, the goal of treating cancer is to treat cancer before it's cancer. It's to treat the disease before it's a problem. And in my opinion, a lot of what we're doing in the West and the United States is we're waiting for the crisis to occur, and then we're looking to treat it. Oh man, the planet is warming. Where did that come from? Well, what did we think was going to happen from industrialization to now, releasing these billions of tons of gases? We may not have understood the greenhouse gas, the greenhouse effect exactly, though the research really dates back to the end of the 1800s, and there was modeling by this scientist that indicated that. But even separate from that, what did we think was going to happen? It's all going to just go away, right? We're gonna burn coal and gas and all this stuff, and it's not going to have an effect. That's waiting for the crisis to occur before we respond. So again, we may not have understood the specifics of what climate science is talking about, no, but we could guess that something is going to happen. And Chinese medicine is not based on guessing, it's based on probabilities. It's based on the understanding of if we start here and we head in this direction, it's likely we're going to end up somewhere over here. So it's the possibilities rather than the guarantee, and I think it's a very significant issue medically and scientifically to wait for quote-unquote proof. The proof that cigarettes causes cancer, the proof that greenhouse gases warms the planet. If we wait until there's proof, you already have the crisis.
And nobody's responsible.
Right. Right. Why prevent a crisis before it's a crisis? If we wait until we know the toxic effects of DDT on non-human life and human life, we've created a crisis. If we wait until we're 100% certain that GMOs are going to affect us negatively beyond an unreasonable doubt, we have the problem. Treat the problem before it's a problem. So that's based on an inductive understanding, an understanding of patterns and understanding of livelihoods. Chinese medicine is really good at that. Yeah?
Yeah, Brendan, what I also hear you talking about when you bring that up in terms of the feminine is intuition.
Sure.
And that's that knowing without the facts.
Right.
And I think the two things that I'm getting from what you're sharing and what other people are talking about is one, that idea of intuition and trusting our guts and our inner knowledge, and also my personal responsibility. It's really easy for me to sit and get a lot of heat around fear and look at this from a distance and say, if everybody would just line up, we could turn this thing around. But in those moments when I feel the most helpless, I'm always empowered to do what I can do within my own self, and I hear you calling me to find the balance within myself first. And that, I can do that every day. So there's a lot of empowerment in what I hear you talking about.
The individual is global. Our own internal condition is reflected in the climate. It doesn't mean that organizing and that external stuff is not important. It doesn't mean the yang is not important. But balancing the yin and yang internally is part of the cure for climate change.
Right, I
It really
see
is.
that.
Yeah.
I'm getting back to this battle again. I got a point I'm trying to make, and nobody's addressed it yet. So Kathy here is gently pulling southeast. I am. But the Walmarts, the Monsantos, the Exxons, the Apples of the world are vigorously pulling in the other direction. You think we're gonna win?
I don't think it's about winning and losing.
I do, because if they,
I think winning. I'll equate it in terms of martial arts. I practice and teach martial arts. I practice and teach Tai Chi Chuan, which is a more internal form of martial arts. If we look at it in terms of winning and losing, I believe we've already lost. Because it's not about winning and losing. And this is not to deny the severity of the problem. It's to say that if we conceptualize it in terms of success and failures, it's not a holistic understanding. Maybe what really needs to happen is rather than tack to the southeast immediately, maybe we need to tack to the southeast when we get here. I don't know the specifics. I believe, a clear understanding of the trajectory. How it's going to happen, I'm not sure. But rather than taking our energy, our qi from the Chinese view, and putting it towards that, just put it towards balance. Put it towards a movement towards the end. That's my view. In martial arts, my teacher and his teacher, actually they would say, and they were very extraordinary. They are very extraordinary martial artists. They would say, invest in loss. Lose over and over and over and over and over again. And the reason you do that is because every time you lose, you learn something. You learn and learn and learn and learn. And then eventually there is the understanding, the individual and the collective understanding of the end. So whether we win or lose, I don't know.
Well, I'm talking about winning and losing. I think that the closer we get to that northeast direction there,
Yeah.
the closer the earth organisms, including human beings, the quality of life's going to get worse and worse and worse and stuff like that. That's what I'm talking about losing.
Right.
But again, I get back to that question is, so how do we get this pull in the other direction? With your tomato plant, what's the water?
The water is the quiet, the coolant, the small,
But
the
on
local,
those
the
are nice words,
introspection.
but on a real practical basis. Let me have to answer
The
my own
coolant,
question.
the
On
small.
a real practical basis.
Like in
He's saying it, he's saying it.
Yeah, that's the answer.
Now,
That's my
what I
answer.
say is it's education.
What's that?
I say it's education, because there's so many people who
Right.
do not understand this at all.
But what are we educating?
Yeah, exactly.
No, it's not about, I know what we want to educate,
Yeah.
but we aren't doing it.
Oh, yes,
We are
we
not
are.
doing
Yes,
a
we are.
good job
We are
of it.
doing it.
Well, I would say that there's.
Oh, yeah, we are doing it right here, but this is the choir. I'm sorry, people, this is the choir.
No, I
There's
understand
a
that.
whole
but-
bunch of other people out there who are not listening, who don't want to listen.
And you're always going to have those people, though. I remember approaching a friend once when we became friends, and I said, I don't understand. You're this wonderful person, blah, 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 but I don't, where do you give back? Where do you volunteer? And she said, I don't, Susan, I meditate. I meditate for an hour every day. And I said, well, that's wonderful, and I really applaud you for that, but how do you give back? She said, well, when I go to the market, and the kid in the market puts my milk on top of my tomatoes, and if I don't meditate, I want to reach over and strangle him. But I just smile and say, hey, let me show you another way you can pack that bag. And that, I think, is what you're talking about. It's in here. So she didn't go out and volunteer and do all that stuff I did, but she affected every single person that day in such a positive way that maybe the woman next door that didn't do the meditating sort of built that fire.
We're each doing our own.
I am extremely hopeful that this whole process will head in that direction. I'm going to tell you a little personal story as to why I say this. I taught environmental science for 35 years in public schools. When I first started out, it was fine. We developed our own curriculum and so forth and so on. And then the businesses out there said, hey, wait a minute, we don't like what you're teaching in school. Literally. It was in the newspaper and so forth and so on. And next thing you knew, we weren't teaching it anymore. More recently, I have approached a congressman, and I've said to him, I said, look, we need to put environmental education back in the schools. Here's what we really need. Junior year, ecology, so they understand the principles. Senior year, environmental principles. And he stepped back. This is a well-known congressman. He steps back and looks at me and says, oh, but I'd be afraid of what they would teach. Now, that's what I'm saying to you, is we need this education. It needs to be to the people out there who aren't part of the choir.
No, I would agree with that.
I think that's what's going to push us in that direction.
I would agree with that, and my view is would be to teach from the yin. And because when we say teaching, a lot of things could be taught, but my understanding of the situation is the yin balances the yang. The quiet, the contemplative, and the water balances the fire. So let's talk about this in terms of cultural stuff, or even in terms of organizing. One approach, and I was an activist and an organizer and had lots of fire, often way too much fire. So one approach to something that's going on would be the approach of, from a martial arts view, karate, or kaiju kempo, for example. Something comes in and you block, right? And that's appropriate. You know, the XL pipeline, people are talking about demonstrating in Vermont, and I'm going to go, and might fly down in front of things, as I've done before with other people in Vermont. So it's not that that block is always a bad thing. But over the long term, in terms of real cultural transformation, blocking is meeting yang with yang, right? Is there a time and a place for that? Yes. But what is the transformation of the yang? The transformation is from the yang into the yin. So this does not mean that we're not engaged, but rather than blocking with something like Tai Chi Chuan or Aikido, you're meeting, you're blending. Because when something is really yang, if something is too much here, it's too little back here. So you allow something to come in. You allow the imbalance of the person, of the institution, of the culture to come in, and you're engaged, and you allow it to throw itself off. So it's not that you're not organizing, it's not that you're not engaged with this force coming in, it's a question of how you meet it. It's a question of, are you going to block? And the thing about blocking is very tiring. If you keep blocking, eventually you get bruises and they get bruises, and who wants to block all day? But you can blend all day long. Something can come in and you take the excess here and you meet it, and the weakness is back here. So you meet it here and so it's a question of approach. Yeah, Bonnie.
Just a little bit of insight, because we were talking yesterday, something that you brought up too is the idea of momentum. And so if somebody's coming at you, or if there's a stress or force and it's coming at you, the least resistance, the least stress for you as an individual would be to, well, for one, just create alternatives. And that's what you were bringing up. So instead of, there are people who are going to fight, and there are people who are going to find another way. And us getting together, and this is the first time for me coming to an event like this, I will take what I have here and I'm going to bring it back to my local, to my family, my daughter, within my community, and take back what I learned. And that education, and I would say not that it's necessarily more feminine, but it is more feminine. It's more of a male idea to bring this force or bring this energy, but from my understanding is bringing in the yin, which would, for one way, be education, bringing in the alternative, which is something different, creating something that doesn't exist.
Yeah, and again, this is not in any way to imply that the feminine or the yin or the water is not powerful. In Chinese medicine, this is what is ultimately powerful. In the Tao Te Ching, one of the spiritual philosophical texts in Chinese culture, the true sage takes water as her teacher. Right? This is the power. This is not, new agey. This is not everything is fine. This is the power. You can call this yin organizing. Yin organizing is just to be like water. There's no real leader. There's nothing to decapitate. It finds where it needs to go. If you dump water on the floor, you can say, oh, there's an obstacle that needs to go around. For water, it's not. They'll go under, they'll go around, it'll wait until you move the podium, and then they'll find it's where to go. It's not that it's not engaged, it's just soft. It's malleable. It'll go where it needs to go. In terms of political organizing, having been involved with groups that were, let's see, drawing the attention of different policing organizations, both federal and local and state, a yin approach is really diffuse. Right? There's no one to take shots at, literally and metaphorically, because it's just water. It's just everywhere. Yeah.
I went to a peace conference in Newark a couple years ago, and the Dalai Lama was there, and he was answering the question of a very good activist from Vermont, a woman, but she was angry and wanting how to do what she did. He said, you can't go on a peace march if you're angry and affect peace. You have to find peace within yourself.
And I know we have to end right now. My kind of closing statement, I'm very happy to hang around and talk, is if we want a cooler, more yin planet, we have to become cooler within ourselves. And that's where the power is. So thank you very much. And if you could fill out...
When's your book coming out?